Singularity.
You're watching Singularity One-on-One, and my name is Nicola, aka Socrates. Today, my guest on the show is George Dyson. George Dyson is a technology historian well known for his books such as Darwin Among the Machines and most recently Turing's Cathedral. Welcome, George. It's very nice
Thank you.
to have you on the show.
Yes, good to be here.
Fantastic. Just before we jump right into the meat of the interview, I want to invite our viewers and listeners to support this show in one of two ways. Number one is, guys, feel free to go on iTunes and write a very brief review for the show, which would help me spread the word and let more people enjoy the interviews that I do with amazing people such as George Dyson. And number two, of course, is you can always go to the donations page and just send any money that you deem appropriate, for which I'm very thankful. Okay, moving on with the interview. George, let me start here with the first question, which is, can you tell us perhaps how and why you got interested in technology and in history, and which one was your original love?
Well, the original love was technology, not history. And I think that's just something that is true of most children. As a child growing up in New Jersey, I was interested in animals and machines, sort of very clear.
Very, very interesting. And perhaps some of our viewers and listeners may not be aware of the sort of incredible opportunity that you had growing up in the family that you did. Your father was Freeman Dyson. Your mother was another one of the Institute of Advanced Studies scientists. Your sister Esther Dyson is another computer luminary. So perhaps you could share with us a little bit about that kind of unique experience.
Yes, well, it was not that interesting for a child like me. I mean, to be growing up with theoretical. My mother was a logician. My father was a mathematical physicist who really only worked on paper, except for a few exceptions. But at this place where they worked, there happened to be a very small project in an outbuilding behind the main buildings where a computer was being built. And that fascinated me because it was real hardware and real engineers. And they left a lot of scrap mechanical stuff lying around that as a child at that time you could actually physically remove vacuum tubes and take things apart with wrenches and screwdrivers. Hard to do that now.
And so how did you end up connecting those two things, your personal experience growing up and taking apart the scrap from the sort of Institute of Advanced Studies, or the first computers, ENIAC and so on? I think, was it called ENIAC at the time?
It was called MANIAC.
MANIAC.
ENIAC was the archetypal machine, and the follower of ENIAC was named MANIAC, Mathematical Numerical Integrator and Computer.
And so how did you connect that kind of personal experience with your consequent love of technology and then eventually moved into sort of the history of it?
Yes, well, it's not necessarily only a love of technology. It's also, in some sense, a fear of technology. But it's, if you're living in the jungle, you want to understand the sort of larger animals that might prey on you. So I always had a mixed fascination with computers, but at the time of my childhood, there was one computer. There was just one machine, and people came from all over the world to run their problems on it, sort of put in questions and wait hours or minutes or days, sometimes months to get the answer. And so very quickly, by the time I became a teenager, the computers were everywhere. And that fascinated me. How are they sort of reproducing so quickly?
Mm-hmm. And how is it and why is it that you decided to go back sort of and look into the history of how the whole thing happened and look at the people involved in it?
Well, I think the people who really, in your classic case of the people who really did the work were the engineers, and they received very little credit. And so in a way, my job is sort of to try and tell the full story more, who really did what with their own hands, and not necessarily who got the credit later.
So was the motivation sort of setting the historical record straight in a way and giving credit to those people who were under appreciated for their contribution?
Yeah, in some sense. And then also just simply curiosity. As a child, I was really curious about what was going on, and nobody could really explain it to me. So, before it was too late, I wanted to find out. Well, there were still a few people alive who had been there.
Yeah, I cannot imagine a better environment, perhaps from the outsider's point of view, of a curious child, for a curious child, other than growing up around and within sort of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. And one of the other interesting biographical notes that I came across here with you is that Einstein's secretary was your babysitter. Was that the case?
Yes, who's another person who doesn't get enough credit. I mean, how Einstein didn't have Google, or a personal computer. So yet he had to answer dozens of people every day, had to keep things. So, Helen Dukas was his computer, his search engine, who, kept track of everything he ever knew, every scrap of letter he had ever written. She sort of still had in her mind, could find it for you. And unfortunately had no children of her own. So she sort of more was really the babysitter of my younger sisters, and I just sort of made trouble for her by being this young kid asking questions all the time.
And I imagine both her and all those people around you as you were growing up, do you find yourself, at certain moments in your life that you suddenly realize how deep of an impact they had on your character and on what you ended up doing?
Yes, of course, you don't realize that later. As children just take for granted the environment in which they grow up.
Yeah.
But the thing to remember is that this institute, which has no real connection to Princeton University, it's absolutely independent. Mm-hmm. And people come there to work in all fields. We remember the Einsteins and the Oppenheimers, the mathematicians and the physicists, and we've also pay less attention to the art historians, the linguists, or sort of any field of study. If you have an interesting problem you want to work on, you apply, and there's various schools, and you can go there. You either go for 1 year or you go for your entire life and work on whatever interests you. And again, I sort of took that for granted, that if you were interested in something, you could work on it.
Yeah, actually, one of my professors at the University of Toronto, Nancy Kokas, she's a political scientist, and she went for a year to visit at the Institute for Advanced Studies, which was an amazing experience.
And it's a very important year for many people, much more. So the impact has been much larger on the large numbers of young people who go for 1 year than the few sort of anointed, people who get to go for life. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. George, I would like to proceed our discussion by focusing on your books. But before that, just as a curiosity, would you mind telling us a little more about your interest in boat building, perhaps? And how is that connected with technology, or is it?
It's very connected. I mean, boats are one of the earliest and most advanced technologies, and many of the sciences that we, again, take for granted, astronomy and navigation and so on, were developed by seafarers. And so, and I can tie that sort of back to one of these days that I was making life miserable for Helen Dukas, the babysitter. She said, "Why don't you read a book? Be quiet." And I said, "There's no books to read. I've read all the books." I meant the children's books. And she said, "Why don't you read a grown-up book?" And I'm not interested. And she went up to shelf and pulled down a copy of Kon-Tiki, which was published in 1953, the year I was born.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was still a fairly new book, and gave me that book. And that was the first adult book that I read, was the expedition of the Kon-Tiki expedition. And I think she had a very good instinct that maybe this would interest me. And she was right. That's sort of the rest of my life until I got sidetracked in computers was all working on building boats and the history of boats. And very much my life, I modeled my life on Kon-Tiki. I thought that was the greatest thing anybody had done.
Yeah, that's funny, because I remember I was probably grade 1 or grade 2 or something. That was also one of the first books that I got as a present for my birthday, I think from my aunt. And if I remember, it was about Tur Heyerdahl's craft, right?
He builds a balsa wood raft in South America and sails it to the South Pacific, against, of course, any advice, and seemed pretty crazy, and they barely survived, but they did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a vague recollection, but I remember enjoying it immensely and opening up sort of a window of the world in front of me, because I was growing up, of course, at the time it was a communist Bulgaria behind the Iron Curtain, so that was like really a faraway world for me then. Okay, let's move on to your books, and I'd like to start with the first book that I read by you, which is called Darwin Among the Machines, The Evolution of Global Intelligence. So, first of all, I don't know if that's the best way to approach it, but I'd like to ask you, what's the connection between your title and Samuel Butler's title?
Well, I took the title from Samuel Butler. Samuel Butler, who is really the main hero of the book. The book is really a tribute to him. He again, the problem is if you do, people tend to be remembered for one thing. So Samuel Butler is remembered for his fiction and largely forgotten for his nonfiction. But he was in many ways still Darwin's sort of most insightful critic. And the interesting thing is that now many of the criticisms of Darwinism that were raised by Samuel Butler are valid scientific subjects today, that there really is more going on with evolution than the sort of straight natural selection. In fact, it's not even Darwinism, it's what we call neo-Darwinism. Darwin himself would not now necessarily be classified as a Darwinist. But Samuel Butler in 1863, or 1859, he goes to New Zealand just before Origin of Species is published. And so at that time, it took 6 months to get to New Zealand by sailing ship. So he gets there, builds a cabin, and becomes a sheep herder. And the next ship brings a copy of Origin of Species, which he reads in the back sort of wilderness of New Zealand, and has all these insights into how Darwin's theories will apply to technology, and wrote about it in a way that's just still utterly fresh.
Mm-hmm. And what is this book about, in your own words?
Well, I would reverse the subtitle. Authors don't get to choose a subtitle. So the publisher called it the evolution of global intelligence. But I think a better subtitle would be the global intelligence of evolution, because really about half the book is about how evolution itself is an intelligent process. And that's what Samuel Butler was arguing. And it's not the intelligent design we have today of a top-down intelligence. It's a bottom-up intelligence. That's a very different thing, and I think a very profound insight that still is underappreciated.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to read just a couple of sentences from the preface, which may help some of our viewers here who haven't read the book to get the idea. This is a book about the nature of machines. It is framed as history, but makes no claim to have separated the fables from the facts. And then a little bit later it says, in the game of life and evolution, there are 3 players at the table: human beings, nature, and machines. I am firmly on the side of nature. But nature, I suspect, is on the side of machines. And then you end up the preface by saying, "We are brothers and sisters of our machines. Minds and tools have been sharpened against each other ever since a scavenger stone fractured cleanly and the first cutting edge was held in a hunter's hand. The past is where we find answers to our questions. Who are we and why? The future is where we see questions to which the answers are up to us." So the questions that you pose is, do we remain one species or diverge into many? Do we remain of many minds or merge into one?
Yeah, it's good questions. And that, of course, that book came out in 1997, so it's sort of in internet years. It's
In a way, it
ancient.
was really early. I don't think it's ancient. I think it's kind of very much forward-looking. It in a way anticipates many of the questions and sort of the direction that things took over after that. So I really, really enjoyed it, and I think it's very much worth reading and rereading. Actually, I had the occasion to sort of glance through it again and look at and sort of where I sort of underlined certain passages and reread those, and that was still very, very useful for me. But let me turn the tables and ask you those questions that you posed yourself. So do you think, in your opinion, we are going to remain one species or diverge into many?
Well, there's two answers. One is short term or long term. On the long term, I think we clearly are going to diverge into many species, but the problem is, before we get there, I think the whole notion of species is changing. That's one of the things that happened almost faster than I anticipated in 1997. The advances we've made in sequencing and transmitting nucleotide sequences, the whole sort of idea of what is a species becomes something quite different, and the idea that, which turns out was much more a part of our history as living organisms, that for a lot of the history of living organisms, we didn't have species the same way we have today. We had much more, and it turns out we still do, sort of lateral gene transfer, where the notion of species is that you only get genetic information from your ancestors, not from your neighbors. And that turns out to be not entirely true.
And what about yeah, go
about
ahead.
the mind? Oh, you asked about the
Yes,
mind.
yes.
Well,
What about the mind? Are we to merge into the Borg?
I mean, there, I think the answer is clearly yes. I mean, it's again, at the time I wrote that book, the most successful search engine was Alta Vista. Can anybody remember Alta Vista? I mean, Google was sort of a speck on the horizon, and that's what it is. I mean, it is the global mind, and we're adding to it, in a way that Samuel Butler imagined, but not a lot of, it's going to advance. As I'm sure that'll be your next question, what happens, but the global mind that people like H.G. Wells wrote about, something it's here. I mean, it's not a question of when, it's the question of what we do with it.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly the direction that I'm leading towards. And in order to do that, I want to read a short passage from Samuel Butler, who says, "Day by day, however, the machines are gaining ground on us. Day by day, we're becoming more subservient to them. More men are daily bound down as slaves to tend them. More men are daily devoting the energies of their whole lives to the development of mechanical life. The upshot is simply a question of time, but that the time will come when the machines will hold the real supremacy over the world and its inhabitants is what no person of a truly philosophic mind can for a moment question."
Yes, he was right, except that it turns out, from the machine's point of view, it's better to do it with rewards than slavery. I mean, just pay the people who write software really well, and pay the people who who design iPads well, and it all moves forward very quickly.
But isn't the bottom line the same thing in the end? If they become the masters of this world, as he puts it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think again, if you took Samuel Butler for a walk today, he'd just see all these people being told what to do by their iPhones. They're looking at their iPhone, and the iPhone says turn right at the next intersection, and they turn right. And, go to this meeting, do this. It's Samuel Butler's world is very much here.
And so then, if you accept his diagnosis, what do you think about his treatment? I mean, later on he says that the machines were ultimately destined to supplant the race of man and to become instinct with the vitality as a different from and superior to that of animals, as animals to vegetable life. So they made a clean sweep of all machinery that had not been in use for more than 271 years. That's what he says in Erechon.
Yeah, that was his, being a writer, you really can only put this stuff into novels because otherwise people get bored with it. But so he wrote an anonymous novel where he sort of tongue-in-cheek took the position of, okay, well, the only answer to this problem is to not use any machines that you'll see that in like Neil Stephenson's next to last novel, Anathem, where the human world has divided into sort of people who use very few machines and sort of have and it's what I like about Neil's novel, it doesn't say it's right or wrong. It's just you can make a choice which world you want to live in.
And what about you? Is that the way to do it? Should we become Luddites?
No, I think the Luddites are misrepresented. I mean, we.
But wasn't Samuel Butler in a way sort of the intellectual sort of giant of Luddites for the 19th century at least?
Not really. I mean, he became. People loved his novel, but nobody gave up their typewriters. I think. I mean, he didn't. He just was painting a picture of how things were and where they were going at a time when it was still mainly steam engines. I mean, he was writing in the by then the sort of late 1800s. Yet he could.
Because I don't want to blame Mr. Butler for Ted Kaczynski, but you could make an argument that, while Samuel Butler sort of wrote about it and sort of philosophized about it, then Ted Kaczynski actually took that kind of ideology or philosophy or outlook and then converted it into sort of justification for radical action.
Yes. Yeah, I think I even came up on the suspect list because when they were trying to find Ted Kaczynski, they were combing through his manifesto, looking at all his sources, and then they were going to. It was an early case of university libraries being subpoenaed to supply circulation records. They were trying to see who was taking out those books, and I'm sure my name came up.
And so what is to be done then? I mean, one person like Unabomber says that we have to resist. We have to, and just like Samuel Butler, basically we have to destroy all machines and keep all development at sort of a pre-industrial revolution level, or just as other people like transhumanists and so on, or say that we have to embrace it and go all in, sort of double or nothing kind of.
Yeah, no, it's not one or the other. I mean, the real path is in between somewhere. We can't. I mean, it's too late to give up technology. I think it clearly has a life of its own, and it's here to stay. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it's much more an individual decision. What do you in your life do with the technology that you have? Do you do good things or bad things? And that, I think, you case in point, if you studied drones, I mean, there's a technology that has fantastic creative, good applications, and it has very frightening applications. But
Yeah.
it's up to the people who, make the decisions to decide.
So let me just ask you the last question here on this book before we move to the most recent one, and that is, can you tell us a little bit more about the connection between artificial intelligence and the internet that you talked about in your book in 1997? And how do you view that, what you said then, from the point of view of today?
Yes, well, Alan Turing, who's one of the other heroes of this story, he didn't call it artificial intelligence, he called it mechanical intelligence. And that also was Samuel Butler's phrase. And I think that's a better way to look at it. It's not necessarily it's artificial, but it's mechanical. Mm-hmm. And the internet, we in a lot of ways we don't even really know what the internet is. There's so many different definitions of what the internet is. Is it just the protocols for connecting these computers? Is it the computers themselves? But it clearly there's a intelligence in the internet, and where it goes is still the open question. It was when I wrote Darwin Among the Machines, but at that time, of course, it was fascinating to see this thing growing so quickly.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to your most recent book then, which is called Turing's Cathedral: The Origins of the Digital Universe. Now, I have to admit that I was planning to read the book, but I actually was out with a concussion for about 8 days. Mm-hmm. So I kind of failed on that, but I tried to do my best to prepare on it. Let me ask you this. What do you say to people who haven't read the book? What is this book all about?
Well, the one sentence description is it's the creation myth for the digital universe, that all cultures have their particular creation myth. Where did the first life of the first people come from? And in the digital world, we don't really have a very coherent creation myth. So this is my telling, my version of this creation myth, and I think myth is important because it's my best attempt to understand and tell the story of what really happened, but from one perspective. It's not the digital world sort of had many beginnings in many different places, and I follow one thread that I think that a good case can be made that it's the thread that wasn't necessarily better, but it was the thread that became replicated. And
let me grab your point, your thought here, and see if I can dig a little deeper, because writing a history is kind of a very descriptive kind of exercise, but creating or writing a myth has a lot more of a sort of a prescriptive function or element to it, because it's supposed to serve a very peculiar or specific purpose, right? So myth goes a little bit further than chronicle. So why myth? Can you tell us a little more about that? What's the other goal that you want to achieve then?
Well, you can never tell the whole truth and the whole story. There's I mean, as a writer, you have to leave a lot out, and you have to focus on certain characters and not others. So in a way, my view of the history of computing, there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. And the Old Testament, the leading prophet was Leibniz, the very prophetic German mathematician who sort of gave us a real formal system of binary logic. And then in the New Testament, that was realized in machines. And in my telling of the story, the prophet of the New Testament was Johnny von Neumann. Mm-hmm. And in between is this very interesting period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And there, clearly, without any doubt, the person who led the way from the Old Testament to the New Testament was Alan Turing. That's why he gets the title credit in the book.
Yeah, so the prophet is Johnny von Neumann, and in a way, he's kind of like the main character of the book, the main who
Yes.
is like the change agent, if you will. And yet the title is paying, homage to Alan
To
Turing.
Al.
Can you tell us more about that? Why
Yes, because
title it?
It was Alan Turing's idea. I mean, if you titled it von Neumann's Cathedral, you'd be very unfair, because what he did was build Alan Turing's concept, and not only build it, other people were building Turing machines, but it was von Neumann who had the connections and the money and the sort of just this genius for organizing things to put it all together, and he was consulting for IBM, so he sort of inserted it into this mainline path. The thing to remember about Johnny von Neumann was that he was interested in computing, but he was even more interested in the question of self-reproducing machines. When you look at the world today, computer chips are self-reproducing automata. That's what they are. They reproduce themselves. At the numbers, it's millions per. It's when I last checked, it was 2 billion transistors per second are being produced. And they're being produced by other machines. There aren't people there making transistors out of silicon. It's machines making them, and that fascinated von Neumann. I think that's a big part of the reason why the origins of this go back to him getting to work on it, because he very clearly was on that path from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. But let me challenge you on that a little bit. I mean, some would say that ideas belong to those who implement them. And so, for example, if you look at real cathedrals, it's not the people who had the idea to build the cathedral, but it's usually like the queen or the king who actually paid and commissioned the building of the cathedral, or the major architect who usually was dead by the time the cathedral was built or something. So
Yes.
is that
No,
your approach?
I agree. And then the real work is, one corner of one tower is built by 6 people who worked on that their whole lives.
Yeah.
And that really is the metaphor of Turing's cathedral, that it was this cathedral built by enormous numbers of people, but all sort of realizing this concept that Alan Turing had.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, in a way, George, the main character of your book is John von Neumann, isn't it? Hey?
Yes. Yeah. He's actually the source of, or the first use of the word singularity was a conversation between Johnny von Neumann and Stan Ulam, where he said that the progress of technology is speeding up to the point where we're approaching some singularity in the history of the human race.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I've heard that reference many times before, but I was never able to track it down myself. Would you mind giving me a little more information about how I can track it down?
Yeah, well, it's in a letter, so it's not in anything that von Neumann wrote. It's in a sort of the eulogy that Stan Ulam wrote, where he mentions that he had this conversation with Johnny, who was, who's always viewed as this person who was just 100% gung-ho on any, if you could build bigger bombs, build them. If you could build bigger rockets, build them, just full speed ahead. But so Ulam is sort of explaining that no, Johnny sometimes had his doubts, and he believed that we were approaching this singularity where humans would no longer be able to keep up with the machines.
Mm-hmm. Well, since we're already talking about the singularity, I was planning to bring that point later on, but perhaps now is the better time. So what in your opinion then, what is your take on the technological singularity, the way we use it in our modern times, at least since Werner Vinge sort of coined the term, the technological singularity, which was then picked up by Ray Kurzweil and so on, many others?
Yes. Well, I think that the thing for me is that I feel that in general we make a huge mistake that in any digital universe, which is a explicit mathematical thing. I mean, that there is such a thing. You can define a digital universe, and it's a digital universe is bounded by two singularities. Okay, there's the singularity at at when time reaches infinity, right? Which is, and of course you can argue whether we're going to get there or not. But there's a more important singularity, and that's the singularity at t equals 0,
The
and
Big
that's the
Bang.
one I work on. I mean, the
Exactly.
origins. Okay, so
Yes.
that's why my Turing's Cathedral is really. I mean that was sort of a 10-year investigation of the other singularity, the singularity at the beginning. How did this nucleus first start? And that's, you need to understand both singularities. And the other one at t equals infinity, that's also interesting, but it's of course sort of religion, not history.
So that's very interesting, but let's go at it chronologically then. Let's start with t equals
Yeah,
0 and then we go to t equals infinity. So tell us a little
yeah.
more about the origins of our digital universe as you recorded them then.
Yes, and what I'm talking about is not the origins of computers, which of course we've had computers for thousands of years, and there's just been a very gradual, step-by-step process of to where we are now. But in the digital universe exists in an address matrix. I mean, that's why, that's how we're talking on Skype right now. I mean, we're exchanging. Your address matrix on your machine is in communication with the address matrix on my machine, and we're exchanging numbers that are in these address locations, and all the internet is this huge, endlessly growing address space. But where did that begin? It didn't begin. There was a point when there was zero address space, and then now we live in a world where it's effectively infinite, which is what Alan Turing dreamed of. But somewhere in there, something happened, and I'm very interested in that, and I think and believe strongly that it happened in von Neumann's project when they built this first randomly accessible matrix of memory that functioned at the speed of light. And the size of that, which is very interesting, was 32 by 32 by 40 bits. This tiny little universe of memory, all isolated. It wasn't connected to anything else. It was just on its own. 40 memory tubes that each stored a matrix of 32 by 32 bits. So you look at it like a 32 by 32 chessboard, sort of 4 chessboards together, stacked 40 chessboards high, with black and white pawns on every square, and you could move those pawns around at the speed of light, and everything sort of exploded from that. So that to me is the fundamental moment when they turned that memory on. Nothing would ever be the same after that moment, because the way it worked, it took 10 bits to define one space on one of the chessboards. And if you went to that, if you took 10 bits to say go to the space and another 10 bits for an instruction, when you got to that space, there were 40 bits. So you put in 20 bits and you got 40 bits back. And that's the world we live in, where you get, it's like, you take $2 and you get $4 back. And that's why numbers are have effectively taken over the world, because they became self-reproducing at that instant.
Let me ask you this then. Is the atomic bomb in a way the beginning of our digital universe?
Well, it's not so much the beginning, but they were very closely related. And that's what a lot of this story is about, is the very deep relationships between not so much the atomic bomb, but the hydrogen bomb. The atomic bomb, of course, was completely built by 1945, and this von Neumann started working on this, building this digital universe in 1945. Sort of at the end, it was sort of an answer that after the atomic bomb, the question was what next, and von Neumann said computers, as did Alan Turing's group. There were many groups working on them, but the driving question was, would it be possible to build a hydrogen bomb or not? And that was a question that only could be answered by sort of mathematical modeling of a very new kind with much more power. So to do it by hand would have taken years,
decades perhaps. Yeah. So if the hydrogen bomb was the beginning in a way, or at least closely correlated, does that say anything about us or the digital universe that we live in?
Yes, I mean it's first of all it's just very interesting that a machine that was built very specifically to model chain reactions actually caused a chain reaction, right? That's what happened with what you're trying to model in these explosions is neutrons that multiply into other neutrons. The fission just multiplies as a chain reaction, and then that's what computers themselves did. They just began multiplying in a chain reaction. But from a more human point of view, yes, this modern computer was in a way born out of essentially a deal with the devil. I mean that the military wanted these weapons capable of destroying all life on Earth, and in exchange, we got this amazing machine. And von Neumann was very conscious of that his job was, as long and made the deal very explicit, that as long as his scientists answered the weapons questions, they could do whatever they wanted. They could keep the computer and do what they wanted with it.
But what if we got it all wrong? What if the devil actually wanted computers but not the bomb? What if...
That's my theory. I think that's what I'm afraid of, is that we think that we got the better end of the deal, that because we've never used a hydrogen bomb against people. I mean, this absolutely devilish instrument, the hydrogen bomb, which has no military purpose except to kill entire cities full of civilians. I mean, it's a weapon of genocide from the beginning. There's no, military need for hydrogen bombs except to threaten, sort of hold the other population hostage. And we thought that's what the devil wanted, but the bombs have never been used. We sort of, wow, we got the better end of the deal. But my theory is maybe, the devil's pretty clever, and maybe the devil's just waiting, and one day we'll come back and say, actually, I had made this deal with von Neumann, and it's time for the devil to take the computers. And that's what we as human beings need to be ever vigilant about, that the power of computer networks can be used to liberate people, or it can be used to oppress people. And I think we have to make sure that power gets used for good things. That's our job.
Also, it fits a lot more with the sort of a mythological image of the devil, who is more of a seductor. And of course, we all know about this kind of a seductiveness of technology, which sort of slowly creeps in on us, and then we sort of fall in love with it until everything changes. So that's a very, very interesting question. So in a way, are we playing gods then, or are we doing the devil's dirty work? And if yes, then wouldn't that again be reasons for the Luddites to sort of rise up and crush the machines?
I don't think they can. I mean, I think it's too late for that, and that would backfire. That would be more of a disaster then no, it's just, as I said earlier, we have to make these moral choices. What are okay uses of the technology, and and what are not, and that's the hard part, and that's really, I think, what all these myths, every culture has its stories and fables that always warn you that, when you see something that looks really wonderful and gives you power, there's always a catch.
Mm-hmm.
That's very true.
So if I am to sort of change a little bit your statement about the devil may have wanted computers, what if the devil may have wanted artificial intelligence? What about that?
Yes,
Taking it
it's
a step further.
That's, I think, again, entirely possible. And back to the question of whether we are acting as gods or not, I think clearly not. But and again, Alan Turing sort of answered that best. He saw that question at the very beginning when he first started writing about artificial intelligence. He made the statement that when we create, he was afraid of the critics saying, "Well, only God can create intelligence. So why are you trying to do it?" And he said, "No. When we create intelligent machines, we are no more creating souls than we are in the procreation of children. We are merely creating the mansions for the souls that only He can create."
Mm-hmm.
That's really where the title of the book came from. That when I visited Google, I had this blinding realization in 2005. This is not Turing's mansion. This is Turing's cathedral. That's where the phrase came from.
Yeah, and I think it's very appropriate. I also was fortunate enough last summer, as part of my 10 weeks at Singularity University, to go and visit Google, and it was really amazing. We actually went like 4 or 5 times. It was equally mind-blowing every time I go there. But let me ask you this about the difference between von Neumann and Turing. Because on the one hand, it seems that Alan Turing talks a lot about AI very early on, from very early age, a decade or so before the war and so on. Whereas von Neumann, as far as I know, never actually really talks about AI. He talks about computers and so on, but not about AI. Why do you
he
think
never
the
spoke
difference?
about it. Von Neumann was very formal and never published anything until it was perfectly complete, and died suddenly and unexpectedly, or without time to finish a lot. So I think he was sort of leaving the question of artificial intelligence for later. That he wasn't ready to tackle it yet. He had no he didn't. But sort of didn't work in a subject unless he could develop a new theory of the entire subject. I don't think he had one yet, but he was intending to collaborate with Stan Ulam on a book that, if you look at the outline, it really, in many ways, it was a theory of self-reproducing machines, and also a theory of intelligence. But he just never got to finish it.
So it's not as if he was short-sighted and never saw the writing on the wall, in a way.
No, I think he was just very cautious, and he didn't want to make any claims that were not supported by the true reality. So people, when he built his machine, people called it an electronic brain, and he never sort of used that label himself. He was interested very much in the question of how brains worked, but was very clear that they work in an entirely different way from computers. It's an absolutely different kind of intelligence.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this then: if Turing or von Neumann didn't so tragically pass away at very early age, like Turing was 40 something and
41.
Yeah, 41. That's shocking. And then von Neumann was only a decade, like 53 or 54 or
54.
Yeah.
54. Yeah.
So if they had the amazing, opportunity to see our world today, do you think they'd be surprised or not?
They would be very surprised by two things. First of all, they would be surprised at, how many computers there were and how cheap they are and how powerful they are. I mean, this laptop I'm talking to you on has 200 billion times the power of von Neumann's machine, and most of the time it just sits here doing nothing. I mean, nobody's using it, whereas people came from all over the world to use that original 5 kilobytes.
Yeah.
So that would astonish them. But what would really astonish them, I think, would just in a certain way horrify von Neumann. I mean, that this machine is operating exactly the same way his machine operated. It's absolutely not different, except it is faster and more reliable and cheaper. But the rest of it just got frozen in time. I mean, when von Neumann's engineers built that machine, they were trying to solve a desperately immediate problem and built the machine. It's sort of like the saying that generals go to war with the army that they have, not the army that they want. So they built the machine that they could build, not the machine they wanted. And they wanted something really quite different, and they would just be astonished that we didn't change anything. I mean, they all believed in 2 years or 5 or 6 years, we would develop completely different architectures for computing that would be better. Yet somehow we're stuck in this. Just the pattern worked and we haven't changed it.
Mm-hmm. But that in a way only shows how amazingly revolutionary and successful they were in their sort of short-term project, because it has had major implications.
And it shows how sort of unexpected it was that we would get this reliable silicon, that we would be able to build these machines monolithically on silicon with no moving parts, and just keep making them faster and more reliable. Mm-hmm. That was completely unexpected.
Now, you talk about another difference between Turing and von Neumann, and you say that Turing sort of brought computation into the 1D, and then von Neumann took it to 2D, and the future, of course, is 3D. Would you like to elaborate a little more on that?
Yes, that's a very rough generalization, but what Alan Turing gave us is this one-dimensional model of computation where the memory is on a linear tape. Mm-hmm. And he knew that would not be practical, but as a mathematician, it was a wonderful way of describing it, that all the memory you ever need is on this tape, that it's not an infinite tape, but if you ever get near the end and need more tape, there's more tape. Mm-hmm. And there's a difference. It's finite but unbounded is what you would say in a technical sense. Yet that was very slow. You had to go through, if you needed a number that was out 10 miles out on the tape, you had to go through 9 miles of tape to get there. And then you had to go back. And what von Neumann did was implement this two-dimensional matrix, like as I described earlier, like the chessboard, where you don't have to go through the tape. You just have to say, I want to know what number is at coordinates, A8. Mm-hmm. The corner board piece on the chessboard, and that becomes way, way faster and more practical. And that's still the world we live in today. If your computer has an IP address and my computer has an IP address, those are still two-dimensional numbers. They're just giving a coordinate in this amazingly complex, huge chessboard that we're all on with these numbers. And the interesting thing is, why have we not developed fully three-dimensional computation? Mm-hmm. And in a way, the internet sort of allows us to start looking at that, and we're sort of waiting for the Turing and von Neumann to come along and take us into that fully three-dimensional world, because we still are only really doing our computing on this flat. It's as if we were still just doing drawings on paper, but we're not yet doing sculpture. And we could.
Yeah, so is that the sense that you mean, that they'd be surprised in?
Yes, that we're still stuck in this
Yes.
very flat linear model where the computer, again, this machine that's 200 billion times as powerful, it still only does one thing at one time. The at every instant, the other, 4 billion cells in this machine are doing nothing while one cell does one thing, and it's a very wasteful. But so the interesting question is, what would nature do with that? Nature doesn't waste anything,
Mm-hmm.
and I think
I'm thinking,
that's the world that we're.
I'm thinking the same thing. I'm thinking that the human brain has sort of a massive parallel processing power, whereas microprocessor, as you pointed out, are sort of very, very linear, two-dimensional. So do you think in that sense that the future of artificial intelligence will be sort of making that gap, or bridging the difference between those two?
Yes, and real AI may develop in ways that on levels that we don't understand at all. I mean, just in
Mm-hmm.
a very simple sense that what and that if you look at the successful companies, or the big computing operations like Google or Amazon now, I mean, what they're doing is using those wasted cycles. That's what cloud computing is all about. Instead of your computer being, having buying a bunch of computers and using 1% of them, you just use the cycles you really need out of a less geographically confined. You don't know where the machine is, but it's doing something all the time, and that's like our brains when we go to sleep, the brain doesn't stop. It dreams. It does something else. It keeps processing, and so we don't actually know what once we start building these big, you know, cloud organized server farms and stuff, we don't really know what they're doing all the time.
Mm-hmm. So is that, going back to your original book, is that sort of the moment when the internet may kind of end up being the emergent artificial intelligence, perhaps?
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, I think it clearly is, but it's not. It's just such a non-human. What's interesting is in the way, for instance, what Google is doing is to sort of read the minds of all the humans. I mean, there's the sort of science fiction view or the Ray Kurzweil view where you have a computer that reads your mind, and then your mind becomes immortalized. And why would a machine be interested in one human mind? I mean, it's going to want all the human minds. Why just absorb one? So in a way, what Google does is it absorbs the meaning from all the human beings in the world who use Google, add a little bit to the intelligence of the system by what the way the search engine works is it's easy to collect the answers, but it's hard to define the questions. So just
Mm-hmm.
when you went to Google, you saw they collected all the digital information in the world, which is not that hard to do, but nobody has any idea where the meaning is except the people. And then every time we search, that defines a little step by step where the meaning really is in all that data. It's quite an extraordinary way. If Alan Turing was to imagine, when he talked about building his truly intelligent machine, that's the kind of thing he imagined. A machine that would start to learn on its own from people.
Mm-hmm. So, George, time is advancing here, and
Yes.
I would like to bring our interview to a close within the next 5 or 10 minutes or so. I have about 3 or 4 questions left. Before that, I just want to remind our viewers again that, guys, please help us support this show. You can do that by writing a brief review on iTunes, or simply going and making a donation on our donations page on singularityweblog.com. Moving on with our last questions here. So, George, We just covered sort of the T0 of the singularity. What about the T infinity? What's your
Yeah.
take on the technological singularity in the modern meaning of the concept?
Okay. Well, again, I'll be just very technically explicit that, and this goes back to Julian Bigelow, who built von Neumann's machine, and he said in a very simple prophetic statement that I think is not understood by most people. He said, "No time is there." It's 4 words. No time is there, and that's the key thing. That in our universe, we have the time that we're familiar with, where things take a certain, things go faster at higher temperature, they go slower at cold temperature, but we live in a very small range of time scale.
Mm-hmm.
In the computational universe, we made a huge mistake we believe that our computers have clocks because we give them a clock speed, but those are not clocks in our sense. Those are clocks in the sense of regulating sequence. So in the world of computation, there is no time, there is only sequence. One instruction is executed, the next instruction is executed, but it's not, it doesn't have a time scale. So the time scales are completely mismatched. If you were from our world, here's, I have a machine that's a billion times faster than what von Neumann had, it's speeding up. Mm-hmm. If you were living in the digital universe, it would look like the real universe is just slowing down the way our universe started to cool right after the Big Bang. And that's I think the source of this disconnect that we perceive as a singularity, that what's going on in the computational universe is proceeding exponentially faster from our point of view. Mm-hmm. But in the digital universe, it would not look that way at all. It's just unfolding by sequence, not by time. There is no time there. And that's what that means to us is a very, is an open question. How are we going to deal with that? A world that more and more we are entwined with a universe that has no time scale in the same way we do.
Yeah, I think, and that's kind of perhaps the sense in which Marvin Minsky, I think it was, who said that if you are riding the wave of exponential growth of technology, there is no singularity because you're surfing on it. And from that point of view, there is no singularity. But I mean, for the rest of us who would not be such sort of surfers, what do you think, or how do you? What about sort of the implications and the possibilities and the criticisms that Ray Kurzweil has to deal with? You already touched upon the religion point of view. I mean, I interviewed Jaron Lanier, who said that the singularity is basically a religion for geeks. It's the rapture of the nerds.
Yeah. I believe that very strongly. That this global intelligence, if it reads human minds, I mean, it's not going to preserve them. It's going to, eat them like a box of chocolates or something. Oh, that was a tasty one. And it's like we don't preserve our food. We digest it. It's sort of, I think, very naive to think that human intelligence is going to be preserved in any way. It's just going to be replaced with something very different.
The question though is so would we be able to survive it? To survive such an event, even if not in our current form, perhaps in a form of like a merger between man and machine, but
or we may become the sort of the white blood cells that have our function. I mean, it's the history of life it's sort of the way it's been going, is to develop collective organisms. And so the advent of metazoan forms of life wasn't the end of one-celled forms of life. It just was something quite different, where we are made up of trillions of individual cells. Mm-hmm. And that's probably what's going to happen. But the more interesting question is, people think the digital universe is sort of a metaphor. I don't. I think it's real. I think that and the jury's sort of out, but I think in 100 years or 1,000 years, it may become clear that actually this actually was a different this is what we perceive of like the singularity actually was the creation of a different alien universe within our midst. Mm-hmm. And that's a very interesting math. I mean, von Neumann and Stan Ulam, Alan Turing, those people would have found that absolutely fascinating from a sort of mathematical point of view. What is going on in that universe, and can we even observe it?
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So, George, for those who are interested in finding out more about what you do and your work in general, what's the best place for them to do so?
Well, obviously Google. I mean, that's the beauty. Sort of H.G. Wells wrote a book called World Brain, imagining sort of a world encyclopedia where everything, all human knowledge was accessible everywhere. And here it is. Yeah, if you're interested in something, look it up on Google, and you'll find good information. You'll find bad. And what we need to do as educators is teach children to know the difference. But there it is. It's mostly there, and it's there in libraries.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's in a way what I did in order to find you and ask you for this interview, but I have to admit that it was not as easy to locate your email and get in touch with you. I had to push a bit harder in that.
That I intentionally keep that.
You're keeping a low profile, yes, in that sense. Okay, so George, before we part ways, what would you like? What is it that you would like our viewers and listeners to take away from this interview with you today? What is the single one thing that you think is the message that you want to send out there?
Okay, the one word message would be wilderness. And it was Thoreau who said, in wildness is the preservation of the world. Not wilderness, but wildness. So actually it would be wildness. And Alan Turing, when he developed the universal Turing machine, was not trying to develop a computer. He was trying to prove a mathematical point, and his point can be translated crudely into the question of whether, by looking at a string of code, is there any systematic way to predict what that code will do? And that was called the Entscheidungs problem, and the answer was no. And that's extremely important for our future, and what people should remember, that there is no way to completely govern a digital universe. You can never, even any code that even is powerful enough to do arithmetic, you cannot predict what it will do. So that's why the digital universe will always be interesting, and why no one will ever be able to control it. It will always be a wilderness, not not a bureaucracy or a national park. And that's what I think is important.
And that's perhaps another reason why Isaac Asimov's laws of robotics always failed in the end of the day.
Yes, it cannot be. And so all these sort of heroes, Samuel Butler, Alan Turing, Johnny von Neumann, Stan Ulam, they all knew that. Mm-hmm. And the people who did believe that they could control things, it never worked. You're right.
George Dyson, thank you very much for spending so much time with us today.
Thank you. Very interesting conversation. Happy to talk to you.
Thank you.